Hello and welcome to Unit 3, Lecture 2, The West. In the last lecture, we took a look at settling in the West, how the government aided in settling in the West, how the mythical West was not as wild as it was portrayed in Hollywood and so forth. And today we're going to take a look at the conflict that arose between white settlers moving west and the Native Americans that were still present in the West. And the motivation of the United States government and citizens in moving west, and the results of the conflict that arose once they arrived in the West, and how this ended up for the Native Americans. To begin with, the United States government pursued different policies with the Native Americans over the years, ever since they arrived after Columbus and the first English settlers came across. The first step was treaty making. They made treaties with tribes, and tribes were treated as nations. However, most of these treaties were broken. This policy went until the 1870s when it was ended. And that was significant because the tribes were no longer treated as nations, and they lost some power, although most of those treaties had been broken prior to that. The next step was removal and relocation. You go to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and even before that, Native Americans had been removed, put in different areas. Usually a lot of the time they had signed treaties, but obviously the most well-known incident was the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the subsequent Trail of Tears. After the Civil War, a new policy was started, allotment and assimilation, and this was an attempt by the government to assimilate the Native Americans into the white culture. And it was done through a variety of ways, as we'll see, but there was one famous quote by a politician back then, and the goal of assimilation was to kill the Indian and save the man. So they were going to get rid of the Native American culture, the Indian culture, but save the man, try to transform the Native American into a white man culturally. And finally, there was extermination. And extermination was done through the massacres, but also a big part of extermination may have been, killing of the buffalo, something that the Native American tribes all had to, they all counted on and depended on for many things in their life. So in 1800, there were over 30 million buffalo in the United States. But by 1886, the Smithsonian Institute was trying to get some buffalo to show in their museum, and they had a hard time finding 25 legitimate specimens in the West.
And even when your hope is gone, move along, move along. And every little thing about this tells me nothing out there is ever gonna help me. All these words that I hear spoken, just promises broken.
So there were sporadic encounters prior to the Civil War with certain whites moving west, but really the majority of the Indian Wars started during the Civil War and after the Civil War, especially with the Homestead Act. There was an event in 1864. There was a detachment of the Union Army that was off looking for deserters in the West, people that had fled the Army, and they came across a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians that were camping near Sand Creek, which is in Colorado, and a complete massacre ensued. Maybe it was, stress from the war. There's no really legitimate reason to defend what happened there, but most of the Native Americans that were massacred were women and children. And this was the beginning of a long period of Indian wars that kind of coincided with more and more whites moving out west, and the Native Americans were kind of fed up with how they had been treated, and so they saw this maybe as a way of dealing with it. So when more and more, with the passage of the Homestead Act and more settlers moving out west and more raids taking place by Native Americans, the military was ordered to clear out free-roaming native tribes. And this is when the reservation idea came into being, that they were going to try to isolate tribes from each other and give them certain areas where they would be sovereign and have control of. But at the same time, you had certain tribes like the Sioux, led by Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and Red Cloud, and the Apache, led by Geronimo, who were not going to go willingly onto these reservations.
'Cause I'm an Indian outlaw, half Cherokee and Choctaw. My baby, she's Chippewa, she's a one of a kind.
So that you have a period of time from the mid-1860s through 1890, the early 1890s, in which you have this time known as the American Indian Wars. So the goals of the Native Americans is they just wanted to preserve their way of life. They wanted to keep their land. They wanted to have buffalo. They did not want to be bothered by this intrusion of white settlers.
Just leave it alone.
The goals of the American government were quite different. Obviously, we have manifest destiny, controlling all the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific. We discussed that in the last lecture about America believing that they could control this land better than the Native Americans and other cultures. And so this is where they enter into the phase of reservations. And the goal of the reservation was to, make Native Americans not live like Native Americans. They were going to have to, farm. They wanted them to farm like Americans and talk like Americans and worship like Americans. And so this is where we see the Dawes Act. And Dawes was a senator from Massachusetts who believed that he was had the best interest of the Native Americans in mind when he passed this act to try to assimilate them into white culture. They would be given 160 acres of land that would be allotted to the families, not the tribe. So this was an attempt to break up the tribe. Kids were sent off, Native American children were sent off to boarding schools where they would be taught English, given an English name. But in order for the Native Americans to get the land, they had to live on it for 25 years, farm it. And the significance of this was it was an end of American Indian independence. The goal was really to destroy their culture. And really what happened here was, to some extent, cultural genocide. Genocide is the destruction of a race. Okay? Here is a photo of some Native American children with their white teacher at a boarding school. You can see they look nothing like Native Americans. Their hair has been cut to look like American children. They're dressed like American children. They were given an English name. And this was what happened to many Native American children during this era in an attempt to rid them of their cultural beliefs and ways. Now, back to the Indian Wars. What the white citizens wanted to get out of this, hoped to get out of this, was they wanted to have more land available. And they did. During this time period, the Native Americans went from having 138 million acres of land set aside, and they lost 86 million acres of that land during this era. They also wanted to be protected from Native Americans as they moved out. What they wanted to do with the land, a lot of them, the railroad. They wanted the land for railroad, to lay railroad track. They wanted to be able to farm and ranch. And also, much of the conflict in certain areas was centered around gold and silver, the discovery of gold and silver. They wanted to be able to mine the land. And for all these reasons, much of the land originally set aside for the Native Americans on the reservation was eventually taken away. Now we're going to get into a little bit some of the specific conflicts that broke out. Red Cloud was one of the chief of the Sioux. There were many different bands of the Sioux, and the Lakota Sioux were attacking settlers traveling to Bannock, which obviously is in Montana. Many of you have been there. And also the Fetterman Massacre was one of the biggest attacks in which hundreds of U.S. soldiers were killed by the Sioux, led by Crazy Horse. So you have three really prominent leaders of the Sioux. You have Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull. And they are all have the goal of preventing the whites from taking their land. The Sioux were probably the most iconic tribe in defending their land and fighting the American goal of placing them on reservations. Well, as a result of this, a treaty was established, the Fort Laramie Treaty, which would become important. It gave the Sioux a massive reservation, which most importantly included the Black Hills. The Sioux saw the Black Hills as a sacred ground. And according to the Fort Laramie Treaty, non-Indians could not enter the Black Hills. But obviously, we all know that would change. Here you have the leaders. This is Crazy Horse. And the top left, over on the right, is Sitting Bull. And down at the bottom, that is also Sitting Bull. Well, this led to another conflict. Obviously, gold was discovered in the Black Hills in the 1870s, and the white settlers wanted to get in there and mine for this gold, and obviously this was a violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. So the Sioux under Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull attacked whites that were trying to enter the Black Hills. And as a result, the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, president, sent a force out there to capture Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and place them on a reservation. They believed that if they captured the leaders of the Sioux, that the rest of the Sioux would follow. And now we come to the battle that we are all aware of occurred in present day southeastern Montana, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And here, General George Armstrong Custer, who had always wanted to be famous, he took photos of himself. He was a pretty good general. He had served in the Civil War, but he had this desire to go down in history. And obviously he would, probably not the way he anticipated. He was supposed to wait for reinforcement. They were going to attack this group of Cheyenne and Sioux that were camped on the banks of the Bighorn River, but there was going to be a planned attack. But he could not wait, so he took his men and attacked without waiting for the reinforcements, and the outcome was not all that good. He and the rest of his men were destroyed. And how this was presented back east was, that it was a massacre, that the Native Americans had scalped all these whites. It was not presented how it actually happened, that Custer attacked the Indians, which did happen. So the result was they sent a massive force out to deal with the Native Americans. And eventually the Sioux lost the right to the Black Hills. They were placed on reservations. Sitting Bull fled to Canada for a period of time. But back to Custer, this is how he wanted to go down. He wanted to be famous.
Do it for your country, do it for your name, 'cause there's gonna be a day when you're standing in the Hall of Fame. And the world's gonna know your name.
Everybody certainly did know his name. Well, there were many incidents occurred, but this was maybe the most tragic. The Sioux, after living on reservations for a while and having most of their culture and customs taken away, there was a movement called the Ghost Dance that was started by an Indian named Wachovah. And he was trying to bring back some of their culture. And they would do this dance, and it was a spiritual thing, and they believed that their gods would bring the buffalo back and take the white man away. But the whites were very concerned with this movement of the Ghost Dance. They believed that it was unifying the Native Americans. And so they told them to stop these dances. And they tried to prevent it from happening. Okay. And so there was an incident that occurred where they tried to go and take the guns away from the Native Americans, and some shots were fired. And the Wounded Knee Massacre was the result. Over 300 Sioux killed, including many women and children, and this symbolized the closing of the frontier and the end of the American Indian Wars. The Sioux had finally been broken and defeated. Sitting Bull was killed right prior to this. And so it was an end of the iconic fight against American government control. Right after the massacre, there's some severe weather set in. It snowed, and they could not get out to deal with the wounded and injured and dead. And so when they did, a few days later, the bodies were frozen. And these are actual photos of the massacre at Wounded Knee. Lastly, in this lecture, I just briefly want to talk about the Nez Perce because they're so closely, they were so closely in proximity to the Bitterroot Valley. They were in the Wallowa Valley, which is in present-day Idaho and Washington across Lolo Pass. And they were led by one of their chiefs, Chief Joseph. And the government wanted this land because it was very rich agriculturally. Right now it's the greatest wheat growing region in the world, the Palouse Hills. So they wanted the land. Chief Joseph didn't want to give it to him, but some of the other leaders agreed to give it to him. So the government came, and they were going to force him out. So Chief Joseph took his people in an attempt to flee to Canada. He crossed Lolo Pass, traveled up the Bitterroot Valley, across Lost Trail Pass, and then, where many of you have been, to the Big Hole battlefield site. The Battle of the Big Hole ensued, in which the Nez Perce were able to hold off the American army and continue their trek to Canada. They got 40 miles from Canada, and Howard, who was the leader of the American army trying to capture them, sent word that if the Nez Perce were to surrender, they would be given their land back in Idaho and Montana, the Wallowa Valley. So Chief Joseph gave his famous "I will fight no more" forever speech. He's tired of fighting, tired of running, believes that he's going to be given back his land. They surrender instead of entering into Canada, and they end up on the reservation in Oklahoma. So as you can see, this is a tragic episode in American history where the Native Americans were basically stripped of their entire identity and culture and have been on reservations ever since, where they're facing a multitude of problems, high alcoholism rates, underfunded schools, poor education, and it all can be traced back to this period.